Railways have always been a large part of the history of Bruce County, whether moving goods or people. Today, Randy Schnarr will fill us in on some of that history. Randy Schnarr is a master model maker and retired industrial designer. He has always been interested in trains, making his first models in the 1970s. Randy has long been fascinated with Bruce County rail history. In 2016, he produced a blueprint for an innovative and interactive rail exhibit in the Bruce County Museum and Cultural Center. This resulted in 2018 in a fully functioning exhibit riding the rails of the railways in Bruce County. And I personally recommend it to anybody to go take a look at that. It's amazing. Please let us welcome Randy Schnarr.
Thank you, Marvin. It's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk about railways in Bruce County. And I say railways versus waterways, roadways, and airways. When we first started coming into Bruce County in the 1840s, it was through the port towns. So as it was, winters could be very isolated because, of course, the lakes froze up. Dirt paths were the best we had for roads, but really life was about to change. There was a new technology forming in England where they actually took a stationary steam engine and mounted it on to a cart with wheels, and they made it metal wheels and put it on rails. The beauty of that is it had very low rolling friction, and you could have one engine or locomotive pulling several freight cars or passenger cars. So railways could compete favorably with the water routes because they ran all year round and they could go anywhere, not necessarily where there was a waterway. By 1850, the United States had over 9,000 miles of track, whereas in Canada, we had a mere 60 miles. And of course, the American roads are looking north of the border and thinking, we ought to go up there and take advantage of some of those resources. Whereas Canadians thought, that's a threat to our national unity. So they got off their butts and started to move. The delays were primarily because of the high cost of development, poor communications with the financiers in England, and political wrangling, of course. But in 1849, loan interest legislation was passed that made it easier, puts less risk into the financial side of it. So once they got started, there was a frantic push to link the major centers along the US border. And by the end of the 1850s, there was over 2,000 miles of track. And you can see here that main routes are east-west. There was the Ontario, Simcoe, and Huron Railway that went north to Collingwood. But the rest was the Grand Trunk from Montreal to Sarnia, Great Western from Niagara to Windsor, basically a shortcut for the US to get to Chicago, and the Buffalo and Lake Huron Railway going to Goderich. With all that east-west activity tied up, they started looking north, and in 1856, they started planning the Wellington Gray Bruce Railway. The objectives there were to access the resources in Bruce County and provide services to the communities, of course, and carry Western grain from Georgian Bay to ports in Toronto and Montreal. And here's a strange one, carry firewood to southern cities. Apparently the Northern Railway had a monopoly on it. So in 1864, charters were granted to the Wellington Gray and Bruce to build from Guelph to Southampton. In 1868, the Toronto Gray and Bruce Railway received a charter to build from Toronto to Owen Sound. And on the national scene, Canada had just been formed, or was being formed. And a key factor of that formation was the railway link to British Columbia. So once we had a rail line from the East Coast to the West Coast, that meant that the Bruce County rail lines could link to anywhere in Canada, US, and Europe. Closer to home, what was life like in 1870? Much slower. Roads in Bruce County, as I mentioned, were just dirt paths, and home heating was by wood, lighting by kerosene lamps. Many things just didn't exist. Electricity, for instance, wasn't available openly in Bruce County until 1910. In Southampton, there was a local supply in 1897 that managed to bring electricity to the community. The telegraph was the main form of communication, and the transatlantic cable was placed in 1866, which made it easier for investors, that is the British investors, to respond and help develop. We had no telephone. That didn't come until 1911 when Bruce Municipal Telephone Company was formed. And travel. Going to Toronto from Southampton would take you 5 to 7 days for a return trip. Postal service, Southampton was the very first post office in Bruce County in 1851, and mail would take 3 to 4 days to come from the major cities. And our first automobile showed up in 1904, and it was amazing to me. Stagecoaches were still used until 1925. So here we have a map showing the Wellington Grey Bruce Railway. Made it to Southampton in 1872 and all the way up here from Palmerston into Kincardine, 1874. Now, by the mid-70s, the Wellington Grey Bruce wasn't doing too well in terms of operations, so they leased their track to the Great Western Railway to operate. Now, they in turn had difficulties, and by 1882, they were amalgamated with the Grand Trunk Railway. And of course, the Wellington Grey and Bruce was still just leasing their track out, but they officially amalgamated with Grand Trunk in 1893. But as it seems to go in railway culture, by 1923, the GTR ran into financial difficulties and was amalgamated into the Canadian National Railway. The last growth on the line is in 1971 when a line came from Port Elgin down to Bruce Power. And the first train, this kind of puts it into perspective what we're looking at. This is the first Wellington Grey Bruce train that made it into Fergus in 1870. You can see the celebration that this brought within the community. It meant prosperity for all those towns that it hit. On that line, starting here in Fergus, working our way up into Bruce County, into Mildmay, Walkerton, and Flagstaff like Dunkeld. We have Cargill, Pinkerton, Paisley, Turner's, Port Elgin, and Southampton. Pinkerton is a kind of interesting one because the station was about 2 miles from the town of Pinkerton. And the town that grew up around the station was called Eden Grove. The Kincardine line was completed in 1874. And as you can see, that was a long run coming back up this route. Basically went through Whitechurch, Lucknow, Ripley, into Kincardine. The station shown here was replaced with another station in 1908, actually a first-class station. Georgian Bay and Lake Erie Railway. This is a railway that started, actually it was Lake Erie. There were other railway companies meshed with it. By the time they got up to this area, they ran out of money, and the Grand Trunk Railway took them over. So by 1882, Grand Trunk Railway was into Wyerton. 12 years later, they went from Parkhead down to Owen Sound and renamed the whole subdivision the Owen Sound subdivision. Again, you can see the stations coming up out of Palmerston through Elmwood, Chesley, Dobbinton, Tara, Allenford, Parkhead, Epworth, Wyerton. Notice the small stations that stayed around for a while. They all looked the same. They were all part of the GB and LE design. The larger stations were replaced by the Grand Trunk over the years. So basically now, commodities of life were abundant. You could get your mail next day and big city newspapers daily. Coal and heating oil didn't have to be stockpiled. They could come in as you need it, and you can now get fresh fruit arrive from the southern climates. And probably for most householders, the best part was being able to order from places like catalog houses like Eaton's. So in many ways, it felt like the sky was the limit for resources. While they were building the railway, 2 bridges in Paisley were major engineering accomplishments. The first span was almost 800 feet, longest in Ontario. The motive power on this bridge was limited to smaller classes, and the speed was limited to 5 miles an hour. That bridge looks pretty doggone spindly, but it managed to last that length of time. The original station in Southampton was combined with the freight shed, much like Paisley or Port Elgin. But with all the traffic they were getting with tourists, they upgraded to a first-class station made of brick. Here we see the gang making up the roadbed for the spur to the station. And notice that the tractors were fueled with hay back in 1906. The station's still standing there, and you can see it completed here with the spur completed in and ready to do business. The Toronto Grey and Bruce Railway. In 1868, Toronto Grey and Bruce received their charter, and they built a narrow gauge, 3-foot 6-inch track from Toronto to Owen Sound. They did it by 1873, and they reached Teeswater by 1874. But by 1880, the railway ran into financial trouble and was acquired by the Grand Trunk Railway. So now Grand Trunk was running on standard gauge, they were on narrow gauge, so within a year, Grand Trunk changed the gauge to standard. Now, in 1883, Grand Trunk was having some financial difficulties, so they sold the Toronto Grey Bruce right away to the Ontario-Quebec Railway, which is in fact the Canadian Pacific Railway today. And in 1906, the Canadian Pacific Railway put a spur line into Walkerton here. So now Bruce County has 2 CPR stations. We have Walkerton in 1906 and Teeswater from 1874. Now, the Walkerton location was interesting because the Grand Trunk Railway ran about 2 kilometers outside of the downtown area. In 1906, when CPR came into town, they chose to come right into town. As a matter of fact, you can see the station tucked away in here. The downtown is just to the left here. They had to bring a bridge across the Saugeen River, and all of their railway structures are here on the other side of the river. It's interesting, the trestle bridge was replaced with an iron bridge, which was lasted until 1954. If you go to Walkerton today, you can still see the footings for this bridge. So the good life had arrived to Bruce County. The Ontario West Shore Railway was, I guess I could say, an expensive dream. They wanted to join Goderich to Kincardine. Well, after getting 16 miles of track laid, by the fall of 1911, when they shut down for winter, the workers came to get paid and there was nobody there to pay them. Turned out that the contractor decided he had other things to do with his life, and it seems that the $175,000 went missing. The railway was offered out to other interests to see if they could get it finished, and nobody else was interested, so they ended up scrapping it and selling the track off for salvage. And there was about $400,000 owing, taken up by the communities of Goderich, Ashfield, Huron, and Kincardine, and it took until 1938 for that money to be paid down. Port Elgin Short Line Railway. William Vicker had a bonus from the town of $7,000 to run a rail line from the east side of town down to the shore. The town wanted to be able to transport tourists to the beaches. And of course, McVicker wanted to have a link for his sawmill. Well, the sawmill eventually went out of business and the line was abandoned. The Greenock Swamp Railway. Henry Cargill acquired several acres of Greenock Swamp, and he cleared, in his lifetime, he cleared the easiest timber to pull out. By the time his son inherited the business, he couldn't get at the lumber very easily, so he built a railway to reach deeper into the bush. Here we see they had steel rails, and they also used hardwood rails as they were developing in the bush until they had the traffic. Unfortunately, going that deep into the swamp was very difficult with heavy equipment. And by 1921, they did their last cutting and they skidded the logs to the mill. The business closed in 1922. So looking back through the ages, the motive power changed a little bit. Here we see the earliest engines were lightweight, and I've got a mistake right here. That should be 440, like 44, nothing behind that. Or 26046. This is a 460 here. You notice that the trains had large stacks and wooden cabs, and they were generally very slow. They'd go about 20 to 30 miles an hour. The large stacks on the wood burning trains were because they were burning wood here in the coal box or the firebox. They would, air gets drawn out through the tubes, the boiler tubes, and up the stack. Well, what was happening was wood ashes were coming through up the stack. And of course you have live ashes coming out of the stack, falling on dry grasses or dry bushes, and you end up with a lot of fires. So they developed these stacks with a piece of metal that redirected the ashes down and collected here. They also put a screen across the top. Now, when they went to coal-fired engines, the cinders were much heavier. So they didn't go up the stack. You can see it's a single stack here, and cinders would tend to collect down into the smoke box here. So here we get into coal burners in the 1880s, 1890s, and you see they still have the wooden cabs, the flat tops, but their stacks are straight, and they can go a little bit further on a load of fuel. In 1910 through the 40s, again, the small engines that we see here would all run up through Southampton, limited by the weight capacities on the Paisley Bridge. These larger engines would be seen more on the Owen Sound line. This is a Mikado. It's a 282, and notice the wheels are smaller. It's a freight engine, a little bit slower, but meant to pull. And he could pull about 100 cars loaded with grain. This is a Pacific, larger wheels, largely used for passenger, for faster running. And this was an experiment Canadian National did from 1925. It's a gas electric commuter that worked Southampton line for the 2 years. We actually had to extend the engine house to accommodate it. And here we see that unit pulling a baggage car across the bridge in Paisley. 1957, the first diesel showed up. This was the first diesel here. And these are all freight diesels. But along with that came the rail cars, the dayliners. So all our passenger traffic moved towards dayliners. Now, we don't see very often talk about tracks, but I thought it'd be interesting. Back in the 1870s, switch tracks would have been stub switches, the way you see here, where you actually move the rails over to the place you wanted to go. They proved to be a little bit of a hazard for derailing, so that the point switches were developed. And with a point switch, you can run down this way. If you came down a track here, there's a spring in here, and the train would simply go over it without derailing. So you don't get many derailments with this type of turnout. And here's how complicated going to narrow gauge and standard gauge can get, trying to run the two of them together. When we think of track or rail, rail is not all the same. Earlier rails were very small, and as the weights got heavier, the rails got bigger. So today the rails may be as much as 10 inches high to handle the weights. So Bruce County had a lot to offer. We could now reach markets virtually all over the world, and goods could be shipped anywhere and arrive in good shape. Whereas before, when we were trying to travel over dirt roads, they got pretty beat up. One of our main raw materials was lumber. And we were part of that fabled bush to the north. And wood was used for building and fuel for cooking and heating. Virtually every town of any size had a sawmill of some sort. And we see this sawmill shown in this picture is in Southampton. Port Elgin had one very similar, and so did Wyerton. Logs were brought in log booms and then fed up the ramp here to be cut. This is the Witcher mill in Wyerton. Sawmill business could be very profitable, but it was also pretty risky. Using sawdust to run a steam engine and kerosene lamps in a wood building with sawdust in the air, fires are a major problem. As noted on one site here in Wyerton, from 1869 to 1900, 8 mills had burned on the site. In 1901, Witcher built a sawmill that lasted 9 years until it burned. And after that, the next one he built lasted 44 years until 1954. And it burned and was scrapped, never rebuilt again. Remnants are there, still there for that sawmill. And I talked about Greenock Swamp earlier, just to give you an idea what that early cut was giving them in terms of lumber. It was absolutely amazing. And it developed lumber for 40 years. Of course, the lumber created opportunities for planing mills and sawmills. When it came to farm produce, for grain, during the first year of railways to Bruce County, over 300,000 bushels of grain were shipped to Canadian and international markets. And flour, most communities had their own flour mills, adding value to their grain. Turnips, we tend not to think too much about turnips, but we, out of Mildmay and Dunkeld area, are one of the capitals in North America for growing rutabagas. In the fall season, refrigerated cars from all over North America would line up to get their load of turnips. Now, refrigerated cars tend to be very colorful, painted in oranges and big names on them. So they were kind of interesting to watch these cars come through. The existence of refrigerated rail cars allowed the shipment of milk, raw milk, cream, eggs to major cities. And most towns had stock pens. Everybody had we even had one in Southampton in the earliest years. It didn't last past 1906. And they would receive cattle, hogs, and chickens. They would receive them and ship them. Now, in 1884, when the GTR ran a line from Parkhead to Owen Sound, they called the new subdivision the Owen Sound Sub. What it really meant was Wyerton was no longer the Wyerton Sub, and Wyerton was derated. They no longer had a lot of wheat traffic, so they were suffering from business. So the leaders of the community decided to invest in other areas or promote other areas. One of the first was the Wyerton Beach Sugar Beet Company, which was built in 1901. And actually the people who built it, they hired a contractor to build it and asked them to run it. Well, within 3 years, it wasn't paying off and went out of business. The second business in Wyerton in the same time frame was the Colonial Portland Cement Company. And they were pulling stone from White Cloud Island and marl from the shoreline. But the business collapsed when market prices went down in 1909. A second company stepped up called the Crown Portland Cement Company, and they started with better equipment and the price markets had improved at that time. It too went down after 1913. The buildings were then scrapped. Now, other businesses were very active in Bruce County. A Lobsinger thresher is a very popular thresher. They're produced well into the middle of the 19th century. And of course, we had the work from the lumber and planing mills. And this is a header mill. They're making headers for barrels. Barrels were, they presaged the plastic drums. And many towns had other manufacturing like woolen and clothing. Naturally, with so much lumber available, furniture was a natural product to be building. And of course, we saw every town like Southampton, Chesley, Hepworth, Walkerton, Waterton, and Kincardine had furniture factories. Dominion Plywoods in Southampton produced plywood panels for those factories, and in the 1940s produced panels and parts for the construction of mosquito bombers. Malcolm Furniture in Kincardine also produced parts for the bomber. The bombers were assembled at de Havilland in Downsview. I mentioned that lumber was one of our major industries in the early days. Well, so was fishing. In 1885, Southampton employed 70 men on 18 boats. A refrigerator car was set on the railway dock each night and was loaded by the fishermen through the night. 6 days a week, the rail car was sent to the Tannack Fish Company in Brooklyn, New York. In 1938, the railway dock was abandoned, and fishermen then had to take their catch to the station where it would have been loaded on an express car, still to the Tannack Fish Company. And of course, in early 1900, Dominion Fish Company in Walkerton received about 120,000 pounds of fish per week, which they would clean, freeze, and pack and ship. Royal Mail. The railway postal services brought mail as early as the next day, creating opportunities for businesses like the catalog sales by Eaton's and Simpson's. When the catalog was delivered, there was a major bulge in the demand. And of course, once the catalog was out there, there was a fulfillment of all the orders for people buying things. All of a sudden, people could choose from thousands of items to buy. Postage cost 1 cent an ounce. And if you want to have some fun, go to the Toronto Public Library and look up Eaton's catalogs. When you see the catalogs from 1906, it'll make you smile with the different styles. Freight services, before the Welland Canal, the ports of Wyerton and Owen Sound, they do receive freighters and they carry grain. Hundreds of rail cars loaded with grain were shipped weekly. Freight services, we have carloads. If you had a spur, the carload was dropped direct to your door. If not, you go to a place where they drop the car and you can go pick it up. I remember as a kid watching a local lumber yard pick up lumber where they dropped the car on the siding. And of course, since oil and coal were readily available, they didn't have to stockpile it. This was a coal shed. And back in the 1870s, through the 70s and early 1900s, coal was king, very, very prominent. Here we see a lumber shed in Southampton. Lumber would be brought in, mostly the grades of lumber that weren't local. Tourism. The railway served more than just commodities. If you were going west from Southern Ontario, generally you would take a train to Owen Sound, hop on a ferry or a ship there and go to Thunder Bay and pick up a train to go west. And of course, the beaches of Lake Huron attracted tourists from Southern Ontario to Kincardine, Southampton, and Port Elgin, creating an extensive hotel resort industry. Life along the railways. The railway employed people from all walks of life. Railway operation Central dispatchers had to monitor trains versus schedules to make sure they operated efficiently. This is an office, 1900 Grand Trunk Railway Yard office, where incoming rolling stock is sorted and assigned for outgoing trains. Now, what would happen? Guys like Art Eby and Doug Huber, who worked for the railway in the 50s, they would come to the spare board in Palmerston and check to see where they were going to work each day. So they would stay in Palmerston and go in, and they may end up on a run to Owen Sound. They may go to Kincardine. They may end up going to Guelph. They could go anywhere from there. This is a train schedule after 1932. We have northward trains. Third class were mixed trains. First class was passenger trains, dedicated passenger. And we see southbound trains, so trains going from Southampton down to Palmerston. On a freight train, we generally think that trains being operated by the engineer. Well, they actually had an onboard crew of 5. The conductor was the boss of the train, and he was making sure everything was safe and running on time. The engineer, he is the guy, he had to make sure the train hit the timetable safely and not doing anything going too fast or anything crazy is going to cause danger. Fireman, his job was to stoke the fire and make sure steam pressure was up to handle the trains. And there were 2 brakemen. Now, brakemen handled jobs like flagging. Here you see this gentleman flagging a train at an intersection in Owen Sound. And they would throw switches and do uncoupling and set handbrakes. Usually the 2 brakemen, one would be in the caboose and the other in the engine. On a passenger train, they had the same operating crew of 5 that the freight train had, but they also would have people to handle the passengers on coaches, food for dining cars, and makeup for sleeping cars. What were the coaches like back in 1890? Well, first class was pretty opulent. Standard class, not quite so fancy. All rail cars were illuminated with kerosene lamps. A sleeping car, very fancy, not particularly private. And this car here is one of the rare cars that's a narrow vestibule, as in the vestibule comes out here and the body doesn't come all the way out to the end. They lasted for about 10 years. 1931, the traffic had actually dwindled to the point where they could no longer support dedicated passenger trains during the day. So what they did was they kept the passenger trains, first class trains morning and evening, but the midday passenger trains were added, tacked onto the back of a freight train. Now, that was a slow run because these trains would stop along the way and put this box car in one siding and pick up something else. So it was a much slower run, hence the third class designation. Now, rail lines were point to point. You can imagine we're going from Palmerston to Southampton or Kincardine. When you get to the end of the line, the engine has to turn around. They run best going forward. So how did they do it? Well, they put them on a turntable, much like this unit here. Now, if they had room, they would use a Y, which would allow them to turn. For instance, the train came into Southampton here, passengers disembarked, and then when they're all empty, they would back the train around like this down here towards the dock, and then come back up, and then come right back down, ready to leave. So they could turn the whole train on a Y. Kincardine and Southampton had Ys. Owen Sound had turntables. Railway Post Office. Well, it turns out sorting post mail is very time consuming. So in 1857, the US postal system decided to pre-sort while traveling on the rail lines. The concept was quickly implemented here in Canada, East and West. And basically, you could actually pick up some mail at one station and deliver it at the next. So mail could be that fast. Inside the cars, it's pretty congested. But the RPO clerks were considered a special breed. They were post office employees and railway workers. So they were a combination and considered heroic by some people, especially in areas where train robberies were not to be taken lightly. So to be an RPO clerk, you had to be at least 97% accurate, and 99% was the goal. Tight quarters and time pressures made this a very, very pressing job. And this is a rail car from the Railway Museum in Montreal. Once a piece of mail hit the rail car, it had to be processed, could not come back out again. Nobody could go into a rail car unless they were totally authorized. Okay, Joanne Vogel is one of the person who does a lot of research. She loves postage, so she pulled out postage stamps. And you can see right here, RPO. You see the RPO? That stamp is from an RPO car. Each car had its own stamp, and the cards would go from one location to another, and the stamp would be dedicated to that car. So these things changed over the years. So it's great for historians to pick up and follow what happened with mail. This piece of mail right here is a registered letter from 1951. You can see how many stamps, how many postage offices it went through on the way through. And 3 of those are RPOs. Business decorum in 1899 was kind of pleasant. Will you kindly call at the station to pick up your parcel? This is a picture of loading the mail in Toronto. You can see they're working their way down, loading the mail cars. That was a job for junior clerks because it was generally dirtier work and heavier work. Along the route, there were many stops where there were no passengers to pick up, nobody to drop off, and no reason to stop except there was mail. So what they would do is they would take this hook and drop it down. The mail clerk would hang a bag of mail on a catch post like this. The train would come along, arm would come out and pick up the mail. Now that's picking the mail up. But if you're dropping mail off, the clerk on the train simply kicked it off the train and it was ready to go to be picked up by the clerk on the ground. Very, very efficient. In larger centers, they actually get into a multiple bag system here. Now, the Royal Mail Service continued until 1959 on Bruce County lines, but by 1971, it was gone completely from across Canada. Now, in 1959, losing the income from the Royal Mail was a major factor. That was one of the reasons the rail could exist as long as it did. After that, the death knell had been posted. The section gang, these are the guys that go out and make sure the rail stays good. They had about 15 to 20 miles of track that they had to manage. If a track was too rough, the engineer would toss a marker flag down so they would know where to go and watch for it. He would then tell the station agent at the next town and let them know what to look for. Track requires regular maintenance to remain in good order. If it isn't kept in shape, why it can cause derailments. So what these guys do is they actually, as the ties wear out or rot out, they would replace every 3rd tie over a period of time, and to keep things constant. They would be lubricating turnouts and switches. They realign track. Here they're realigning the track where it's shuffled a little bit on that gravel base. And they would also spray herbicides along the rail to keep the weeds away. It was heavy work, but it was also good work. Here they're replacing rails on a main line. The rail head would actually wear. You see it's on a curve, so there's more wear because the axles on rail cars are solid, and they tend to wear a bit more there. As the rail wears, they would take it off a main line and put it onto a branch line. And if it wears on a branch line, it goes into a freight yard or onto a spur. We all love hand cars. This is a collection of hand cars over the years. And hand cars were kept in section car sheds. Major projects were handled by railway engineers, as in Paisley. This structure went through changes over the years as the loads got heavier. And notice this trestle part right here, over the river. We see in I'll talk just a bit here about the construction of this bridge. It's amazing. This is about 70 feet up. What they did was they made the roll form 70-foot sections of this section here, and then they bolted them together to create a hollow post. And then they bolted them all together. And with a fairly spindly looking trestle, these sections were made by a company called the Phoenix Iron Company out of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. Remember I talked about the trestle before? Here in 1926, they built 2 piers and put in a Warren truss here. So they still have the ironwork back here and back here, but we now have a heavy duty truss. In 1926, they also built a pumping station right beside the track, and it pumped water up to the water tower on the corner of Alma Street and Victoria Street in Paisley. In 1947, a 3rd piling was added and a girder bridge here, 65-footer. And in 1949, they filled this area. Remember how that was all iron all the way back down there? Well, they brought in dirt and just filled it up to reinforce that. Paisley bridges. We think of the main bridge in Paisley, the first one, but in fact, the second one is just as interesting. This is a Google map. The station would be back here, and this is Bruce Road. Here we are, Bruce Road 3 right here. The station was here. Track comes down and comes over the Teeswater River. Here is the first bridge. That's this span. And then down over here is the second span. Totally different construction. But again, the same kind of height. Worth taking a walk out to see these things. This is the second span, more detail on the structure. Now, if you really want to see the old ironworks, this is part of the ironworks left from the Phoenix structure. This is after you cross the first bridge, go down underneath, and this is what you'll find. It's amazing to find this one. Railway stations usually had a station agent, telegraph operator, and a baggage handler. Smaller stations would get by with the station agent, and he had to be good at all these things. Ticket counter at Kincardine Station. Right now he's looking a little bit bored between trains. Engine house. Steam engines were stored out of the elements at night. End of the day, shake down the ashes, clear the ash pan, and bank the fire for morning restart. Lubricate all moving parts, top up the water, and if coal is necessary, add some. Next morning, an hour early, start the fire. Add more coal and get the flames up, get the pressure up. When the pressure was up, the engineer would take control to set up the passenger trains, get ready for departure. Freight sheds. This is a place where less than carload goods. Carloads were easy because you just shipped the whole car to wherever it was going. But there were a lot of goods that were shipped that were less than a carload, and they had to be handled. So they'd be collected in a freight warehouse and loaded onto a train and shipped with lots of paperwork. But on the other side of it, when the train came in and it was mixed less than carload, they would take that and sort it out and ship it to customers. School teachers in Palmerston warned classes to get good education or end up working in the freight shed. You didn't want to be doing that. This was a typical freight shed in Walkerton. Been closed down for a while, starting to decay. Steam engines ran on coal. And normally we show, this is they're loading coal in Palmerston. They would normally get enough coal to last for a return trip, unless there were extenuating circumstances, in which case they would be topped up in Kincardine, Southampton, and Owen Sound. Now, on the other hand, water, which is critical to the locomotive, can't run dry, they couldn't hold enough water, so they would stop every 25 miles and stop at water tanks like this tank here, or a water spout, which would be either supported by a tank like this, or I think in the case of Southampton, using town water. Railway structures, they had all kinds of structures to keep things going. Hand car sheds, I think we saw one earlier. Bunkhouse, if you lived in Palmerston and were staying over in Southampton or Kincardine, you had to have a place to sleep. And the railway will provide a bunkhouse for the rail crew. Tool sheds for tools. And in Southampton, the section gang foreman had his house next to the shed, and the station agent would have had his own residence. A little bit of a departure here in the early 30s. The Depression hit the prairies pretty hard, created a dust bowl, and they were bordering on starvation. A group from Chesley in district put together a refrigerated rail car. You can see the sign on here, with food to support those who were facing starvation out west. Winter. It can create some extreme challenges. You get snow blown across an open field, tends to fill in all the cuts. Here we see the plow foreman. He's perched up in the cupola and he's just praying that you're going to break through the next drift without flipping, derailing, or taking to the field. Plows, this is an early plow on a steel chassis, wood cladding. They have wings that come out, and they would have as many as 4 or 5 locomotives pushing these plows, trying to bust their way through. This is the more recent one. I took this picture down at the Goderich and Exeter station. They had wings on the side that they would push out, and when they get stuck, they pull the wing back in and back up again and take another run at it. Yes, drifted snow can be a very, very formidable barrier to rail travel. Here's one plow that took to the field just north of Chesley, near Dobbinton. Challenging winters, 1904, blocked below Paisley for over a week. 1924, just south of Turner's. For 5 days, I believe that was, they had a crew of 60 shovelers that picked up along the route from Palmerston. They worked night and day, shoveling by hand to get the train out. 1947, possibly the worst storm. Again, at Turner's Cut, they ran into a barrier they just couldn't get through, so they end up going to requesting the big rotary plow from Montreal. The line was shut down for 9 days. Now, it wasn't just the rail line that was shut down. Everything, all the roads were shut as well. It turned out they actually had to do airdrops at Southampton to provide yeast so bakers could make bread for the local communities. And lo and behold, this is what the plow, that rotary plow really looks like. And it's at the Railway Museum in Montreal. It's funny, the local crews, when they got behind this one, they wanted to take a run at the drifts. And the French operators finally got through to them. That is, no, take it slow. You just work your way through slowly. Yes, winter causes problems to railway points as well. And to thaw them out, they pour kerosene on them and set them alight. And if your water tower was leaking, everybody knew it. And here we see the local Union bus. In 1925, they still were horse-drawn, and they put runners on for the winter time. Oh yes, they did have disasters in spite of all the safety precautions. Here we see derailments in Kincardine, Ripley and Kincardine. This one is in Southampton. And it's difficult to consider how that one might have happened. This one was in just south of Mildmay, and we have a few shots of this one. You might find your grandmother or grandfather or uncle or somebody in all this crew. Notice how the engine's over on its side here. Everybody's in for the beauty shot. Same shot, same accident, different views. Train is coming in to start to sort out the mess. Notice the hand cars here in the forefront. It was a pretty big mess. In 1954, Hurricane Hazel range washed out the roadway, and the train toppled over, killing Stuart Nicholson, our fireman, and Gordon McCallum, the engineer. In 1975, the last 13 cars of an oil train, here's what the oil train looks like here, they derailed, creating a heck of a mess. Jim Tipo woke up the next morning and found these rail cars in his front yard. Well, railways brought prosperity to Bruce County, but progress doesn't stand still. Over time, roads improved dramatically. Automobiles were faster, more convenient. No need to wait for a train anymore. And trucks got bigger and more powerful. We no longer relied on a railway for our daily needs. By 1931s, railways were feeling the effects of that progress. Passenger train traffic had fallen off, and they'd gone to mixed trains. 1957, or by 1959, mail service was discontinued. And by 1961, mixed trains were discontinued in favor of rail liners. Rail liners lasted until 1970. By 1983, all these lines had been abandoned. The last two to remain are the Bruce Power line up the Southampton sub, which lasted until 1988, and the Owen Sound line until 1995. The last train out of Southampton, October 1970. The very last train, interesting, the very last train would go over the track, and while it was going over, the machinery would pull all the ties, all the spikes out. Once they went over 300 feet of track, they'd stop and cut the rails, hook them up to a machine that pulled the rails up and threaded the rails down through these cars. Then once they had done that, they'd move up another 300 feet and pull another 300 feet of track. And once the track was up, the ties were lifted by a tractor. Painful errors, painful for a lot of people in Bruce County to see this happen. However, the trains are gone, but the memories live on in stations. And here we have Southampton, Cargill, and Elmwood are currently residents, and Wyerton, this is an tourist information station. Yes, the bridges are still there in Paisley, great memories. And the rail trail groups created community links with boardwalks, kiosks, gazebos, and murals. Here we see Southampton and Kincardin's walkway. And of course, this is the kiosk in Port Elgin. We can still imagine the might of the trains as we walk and ride on these trails. Several books have captured the history of development. Books like Two Divisions to Blue Water, Steam Over Palmerston, The Narrow Gauge Through the Bush. All very, very interesting reading. Now, steam isn't entirely dead in our era. There is an engine at the Paisley Heritage Farm. It's an 040, and there is a group of volunteers who are trying to get it rebuilt with the hope that someday they will pull railway coaches around the heritage site. Very recently, we had the Port Elgin and North Shore Railway that ran during the summer months. And the Grey Roots Museum has a volunteer team building a very similar train, 1:8 scale. And Mike Mason of Owen Sound has a 1:8 scale railway. These are Mike Mason's rail cars. And Clive Morgan of Lion Heads has a private live steam line, 1:12 scale, which he runs around his house. So live steam is still here. Let me tell you, when riding on one of these trains, when you feel You smell the smoke from the coal and hear the chuff of the engine and feel the steam. It is an amazing feeling. It takes you back in time. The Bruce County Museum, the Riding the Rails exhibit relives the train era in Bruce County. For the older generation, a chance to relive the railway experience, and the younger generation, a chance to feel what railways were like. Now, you can't stand back and get these feelings. You need to get right up close. Here on page, you get close, and about 3/4 inch from the bottom of the screen, stand there and watch. The perspective is set up that you'll think you're there. Count the cars as they go by. It's an amazing feeling. This is a view of Southampton, Port Elgin, Paisley in wintertime over the bridge, Walkerton in late winter, and Mildmay in springtime. So railways were the most significant tangible factor in the development of Bruce County for 60 years. Over the following 50 years, the reliance on the railway faded until the costs to sustain it were no longer justified. But prosperity in Bruce County had been attained. Railways are still one of the most efficient methods of handling large volumes over long distances with minimal pollution. Think of grain trains or oil trains or container trains moving a lot of goods very effectively. Lots of books to look at here, and online resources, amazing online resources. I'll tell you, you can spend a lot of time looking at these things. On site, Canadian Railway Museum in Bruce County. Many of the sites are still there, wanting to be visited. And of course, person-to-person assistance. So basically, the Bruce County Railways were a catalyst to prosperity. And that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
The Bruce County Historical Society is recording this presentation, and Randy has graciously allowed us to place it on our YouTube channel. It may take a little while. Robin does the editing, Robin Hilburn, but it will be on the YouTube channel if all goes well, and we'll announce that on our webpage and Facebook social media outlets. So.
Great. We have a question for Randy. Were jiggers the same as hand carts?
Yes, yes. They get called jiggers, hand cars, speeders, a number of names attached to them.
Another question, Randy, what is your next project?
Back to the museum railway. When we put it together, we were rushed to get it there. And we want to now take it and add more stories to it. There's not enough people in it telling stories. We think there's opportunity there. So, and we also want to take, there's 5 dioramas there. Right now they're set in different seasons. We want to take those and set them in 5 different decades as well. So we'll start in Mildmay with 1880s, for instance. So that the cars that are there now will go away and yield to horses and buggies.
Okay, Joe, do you have any more?
One more currently, and the question is, did you ever put a penny on the rails?
Yep. Oh yes, probably a few of them. They do flatten out very nicely.
Great, thanks. There are no other questions, Doran.
Okay, thank you, Joe. What we'll do is, if anyone has any questions they have in the future, just send us an email, and we'll pass it along to Randy. If I could get Anne-Marie.
Hi, Randy. I just want to say you are so passionate about the railway and sharing it with people. And we really, really appreciate you sharing that joy and passion with us today. I enjoyed getting to know you when we were in the planning stages of the Riding the Rails exhibit, and going through and seeing those pictures again today brought back lots of memories. And also looks like you found a whole bunch more photos that you were looking for. So I'm very pleased that the search continued, and you've got a great crew there finding those and being able to add them to your repertoire for your presentations and upcoming additions to the exhibit. So on behalf of everyone here today, thank you and keep up the good work.
Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. It has been a real pleasure to work in this area, and especially with all the people who have joined in just because they wanted to, not because they were railway people, but you just wanted to be a part of it. You know, we had 30 people involved in that museum project. We started out with 3 and went to 30 because of their interest. And there was very little cajoling to get it to come together. So it's just a matter of providing objectives and the tools to make it happen and the information and the way it went. But this has been fun. You mentioned that, yes, there's more pictures from when we were working together. And even though I've put this presentation on today, I've found a few more things I probably would have liked to show them. But it's a never-ending flow of information. So at any rate, it has been fun. And thanks for the opportunity to tell my story.